Hi everyone, welcome to your first video for this week on human rights in the war on terror. This week's focus is on the relationship between terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights, and I want to start off by highlighting three potential relationships in this video. First, there can be a relationship between human rights and the use of terrorism. Why might that be? There can be a few explanations for this possible relationship. One may be that human rights violations committed by the state leads to grievances and discontent. This may be a lack of subsistence rights that lead to suffering, breeding discontent and grievances, or it could be violations of political rights or physical integrity rights leading to discontent. Then, if other avenues to expressing grievances are closed off due to repression of physical integrity rights or things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, political rights, then actors may resort to violence. Another possible connection is that when the state uses violence against its people, other non-state actors may feel justified in using violence in response. There's been some empirical literature to examine these relationships, and the findings are generally that there seems to be a linear relationship between violations of political rights and terrorism. That's the figure on the top. And there seems to be an inverted U relationship between security rights violations and terrorism, as well as between subsistence rights and terrorism. These are the two figures on the bottom. And you can think about this sort of similar to the more murder in the middle thesis from earlier this term. It seems that there's a lower probability of terrorism in very repressive states, and then little terrorism in states with absolutely no repression. But states with moderate levels of repression see a higher probability of terrorism. For subsistence rights, this suggests that for very impoverished states, for example, terrorism is unlikely. This may be because people are focused on basic survival needs and may not have the capacity to expend towards violence and acts of terrorism. A second potential relationship between human rights and terrorism concerns the ways in which terrorism leads to human rights violations. Particularly because terrorism, by definition, targets civilians, the impact of terrorism violates a number of human rights, including rights to life. But terrorism also affects a state's ability to provide other human rights for citizens, such as education. But typically when we talk about the relationship between terrorism and human rights, we are often talking about the effects of counterterrorism efforts on human rights. So the relationship is that terrorism leads states to pursue counterterrorism efforts, and some of those efforts may have human rights implications. So that's mostly what we're going to be talking about this week. This is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but here are some human rights violations that can occur in the context of counterterrorism efforts. An overarching theme here is that there's a tension between security and rights. For example, surveillance operations can infringe on privacy rights. Some might argue that regulated surveillance operations that are aimed at reducing terrorism may be a reasonable infringement on privacy rights. So it's a question of trade-offs. In terms of liberty, certain detention procedures, due process violations, and right to fair trial may be violated also throughout counterterrorism efforts. This week, we're going to focus on three bullet points on this list: indefinite detention, torture, and extrajudicial killings. In the discussion board post for this week, however, you're welcome to discuss any violations in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism. One last thing that I want to point out in this video is that there are certain rights that are considered non-derogable. This means that under no conditions are states permitted to violate these rights. Other rights, on the other hand, can be suspended during a state of emergency. This is outlined in Article 4 of the ICCPR. To use this provision, states are supposed to notify the UN Secretary General of their intention. So arguably, this might allow for some surveillance, for example, that would otherwise violate privacy rights. However, it should be noted that this derogation is supposed to be regulated, intentional, proportionate, and non-discriminatory. Further, there are certain rights that are outlined in the ICCPR that can never be violated, even during a state of emergency, and those are listed here. And those include, for example, the right to life, the prohibition on torture, and other rights as well. In the second video for this week, I'm going to talk more about these, also adding in international human rights law and its relationship to counterterrorism. So your other steps for this week, there's another video. That video is going to talk about indefinite detention and the treatment of detainees. There are going to be a few video clips on Blackboard to watch as well. On Thursday in our live session, we're going to talk about torture in the context of the war on terror, and there will be some discussion questions on Blackboard for your discussion board task for this week. Thanks.